Welcome back. Let's talk about renaming variables. Woo! It would be quite nice if when we got our data sets, the variables had easy to use names, were easy to type, that we could just run our analysis. Yeah, that'd be nice.
Yeah, that would be nice.
But that often doesn't happen. And so I see two occasions where we might need to rename variables. The first is when we read something in from like Qualtrics or a database or something like that. And the second is when somebody else has already done that and they've given them names that make sense to them, but they don't make sense to us. So let's look at an example of each. So here would be an example where we get it from Qualtrics. So it's got a bunch of useless stuff we don't need, like IP address, start date, and end date, and then it has just Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. That ain't all that helpful. We need to rename these. And the second situation looks more like this, where you've got all these variable names that made sense to whoever wrote them, but they're just really tedious to write, and they may not make sense to you. So, what do? You need to rename the columns. No way of getting around that. And so in this data set, it would be very annoying every time you're using the variable to type in the name TVIC_TB_1, which is one of the variable names. That'd be super annoying to write every time. So let me give you the 4 best practices of naming your variables. Universally agreed on by all data analysts. Actually, I'm lying to you. I just made these up like 10 minutes ago. First best practice. Select in only the variables that you intend to analyze. So if your data set has 100 columns, but you're only going to be analyzing 4 of those variables, your data set should only have 4 variables. Number 2, rename your variables to something that is easy to type and easy to remember. So TVIC_TB_1, not so easy. TV, easy. Number 3, this is my most controversial claim. I have a feeling I'm going to have a ton of data analysts just attack me in my comments for this suggestion. But you know what? I ain't budging. Okay, really, it's not that controversial, but this is what I like to do. And that is to rename all variables to lowercase. Why lowercase? Because you don't have to hit the shift key or the caps lock key to type in the variable. It's just fewer keystrokes. And sometimes we just want to be fast and efficient. And then number 4 best practice, and this doesn't really have to do with data formatting as much as data analysis and presentation, and that is to replace your variable names in your plots and in your tables with something that is a little more publication ready. And I'll show you examples of all these as I go along. So with that, let's run into R.
How can we get back on the right track?
All right, here we are. So, I've got the 2 data sets that I showed you earlier. So I'm just gonna read that in again, just so y'all can see it, and then do a head of that. And we see that we've got the Qs, and so we need to rename the Qs to something that has our variable names in it. And then we got the second data set, and if we look at the head of that, we've got all these names that are really long and really tedious to write and not very informative to us at all. So let's go ahead and talk about 2 functions that we're going to use. One is the rename function. And so the syntax for it, like I show here, is that we say, at least if we're within a pipe, we say d pipe rename new name is equal to old name. And this is one of those unusual ones where you don't have to put the new name, the thing that you want to name it to, in quotes. I don't know why that is, but that's how it is. So just as an example, we've got our abstract data set, abstract for abstract names, which is this one over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to take abstract original, and then we're going to rename SEH, or we're going to rename the variable SEH_total_2 to SEH. I don't know why it's the old name second and then the new name first, because that's inconsistent with some other things that there are, but hey, I didn't write it. So if we were to do that, and then if I went head abstract, we would see that somewhere's in there it is, SEH.
Move your head.
Our little lowercase friend. Woo! So the pros of this, it's easy to make sure that the variables are lined up. We know exactly which variable's name we're replacing, and we know exactly which variable name we are replacing it with. The cons to that, though, is that it's kind of tedious to do for lots and lots of variables. If we had to rename all these variables, that would be super tedious. The rename function is great when you are only renaming a few variables. The alternative is the set_names variable. And to access documentation, just like with any function, you could do question mark and then the name of the function. And then, again, this is for renaming all of the columns. And so the syntax is, if you're using it within a pipe, d pipe set names, and then you supply it with a vector, a character vector. But here's the important thing. You have to make sure that your character vector is the same length as the number of columns you have. Otherwise, it's going to give you an error. So let's look at an example. So here's our Qualtrics example. We've got ID, IP address, start date, end date, and then we have Q1 through Q24. So 24, 25, 26, 27, 28 columns. And so here's one thing that here's just an example. This isn't actually what I'm going to do it, but I'll just show you an example of how I might use this. So I might say Qualtrics is equal to Qualtrics original, and then we're going to select ID through end date, so just the first 4 columns, and then we're going to set names C, ID, IP, start, and end. And notice I'm using all lowercase because, again, it's less keystrokes. And so if I do that, I get my new data set, which came from selecting. So I selected in those 4, and I selected out everything else. And they have nice, pretty names now, which is awesome. Yay, fantastic. That's great. That works great if you're just doing a couple. But it would be very tedious to do the Q1 through Q24. So I'm going to show you a faster way to do that. But first, I need to introduce a new function, and that is paste 0. And I'm just going to show you what it does. So here I'm saying paste 0, and then the letter A, and then 1 through 10. And if I run that, look what it does. My goodness.
Heed! Move!
It takes this, it basically combines them and makes a vector out of it. So it's going A1, A2, A3, A4, etc. up to A10. So that's very, very handy when you are renaming a bunch of columns that are in a particular sequence. So the fictitious example that I have here, I just made this data set up, but let's just say that the first 10 Q items are IQ. So we can go IQ 1 through 10. And if I just ran that right there, you see it gives me IQ1, IQ2, IQ3, etc. And then this one is MBI. I don't know what MBI is. I just made it up. Maybe it's the Myers-Briggs, which all psychologists loves. Am I right, psychologists? Ha, ha, ha. And then we've got honest, 1 through 4, which is just honest 1, honest 2, honest 3, and honest 4. So one recommendation is if you're renaming a bunch of columns, I would create a vector of names outside of the pipe, which is what I've done here. So if I ran that bit of code right there and looked at the column names, it's just a character vector with a bunch of names attached to it. So I'd recommend that just because it cleans up the pipe statements. It's easier, makes it a lot more readable and that sort of thing. You don't have to. You can instead just put C and then all that in there. But I'd recommend doing it outside. But let me just say, you got to be careful that with the set_names that you have to make sure things are lining up. And you have to make sure that the object that you're passing it has the same length as you have the number of columns. So here's an example where I have ID, IP, start, but I forgot to put the end in there. And so let's see what happens when we try to pass that to our pipe statement. So here I'm trying to say, take the Qualtrics original and then set the names to this vector. And if I do that, I get an error. Oh no. Why is that? It says, error, RN must be null or a character vector the same length as X. That's a very kind of cryptic way of saying that, hey, the names that you're supplying is not equal to the number of columns. So you need to fix that. And so, by the way, I had this happen with a student recently, and I went through this process, but to debug and figure out where the problem is, you can go length, which is a new function, which tells you how long a vector is. And so that says that's 27. And then you can go end call of the original data set in 28. And we would say, oh dear, I have missed an element in there. Where is that? And then that would help you figure out, oh, I forgot the end. Oh no, that wasn't fun. I'm going to fix that. And then you'd fix it. And then you'd be all good. And let's pretend that we actually did fix that. So I'm going to read in lines 61 through 66. And so now if I do length of column underscore names, I get 28, which is the number of columns of our original data set. And now, whoops, and now if I run that, no errors, and yay. And if I go ahead, Qualtrics, then look at that, my fancy names are all there. So I got IQ 1 through 10, MBI 1 through 10, and then Honest 1 through 4. So we are rolling. So that would be one example with the Qualtrics example. Now let me do a more applied example of using the rename function. So let's say in our rename data set, there is a variable called SSD underscore total underscore 2, SSD underscore total underscore 1, and then SEH underscore total underscore 2. And what I want to do is I'm just going to analyze the relationship between those three variables. And so going with the aforementioned principles of data analysis or whatever I said, I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to give those shorter names that are easier to type and more meaningful to me. So SSD is what I'm going to call it, 2 for time point 2, I guess, and then SSD 1 for time point 1, and then SEH. So these are all lowercase, they're all intuitive, they're all easy to type and that sort of thing. And then the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to select only the variables that I'm going to analyze. And so if I do that, might as well do a head to make sure it came through. And now, instead of dealing with a data set that has like 100 columns or whatever it had, instead, I'm only dealing with 3 columns, and that's easier for me to wrap my head around. So those are 2 examples using set names and rename of how you might rename your data set. And like I said, the last principle isn't really a data manipulation, data formatting principle, but it's more a communication principle, which is to make sure to relabel your variables. So as an example, let's say I do a model where I'm looking at SSD2 tilde SSD1. So I'm trying to predict SSD2 from SSD1. And if I were to visualize this, I might see this fancy looking plot that, hey, that looks cool, but I don't like these labels. SSD2 makes sense to me, but it doesn't make sense to my audience. And so I want to rename that. And I also want to get rid of this model object LM because that might have been informative for me, but it's probably not going to be informative to my audience. So let me show you a couple things you could do. I'm going to do another video where I go more in depth into this because this will work if you have just a bivariate plot. But if you have any sort of paneling or any sort of like representing something as a color or a line or a symbol or something like that, it's not as easy as this, and I haven't yet figured out a good way to do it without a lot of code that I think is ridiculous. So I'll get back to that, but just if you want to relabel the XY axis and get rid of the legend, here's what you can do. You can say, take the original thing that you did, just visualize, and then plus labs is short for labels, and you would say X is equal to, and then the name that you want to use for communication, and then Y is equal, and then you could also change the title, because this is analysis plot, which is what FlexPlot is doing in the background. But if I just want to, give a more accurate title or a more informative title, I might do social satisfaction. And then to get rid of this model object LM, I could go plus theme legend equals none. And so if I do that, then I get something that is much more publication ready. Social satisfaction at time 2, social satisfaction at baseline, and then our social satisfaction title. So I hope that was informative for you. With that, let me review our learning objectives. Shall I? Number one. 2 reasons why our variable names might not be so pretty and easy to use. 1 is that if we're pulling it straight from like Qualtrics or a database, and 2 is if somebody else has already done that and given them names that are intuitive to them but are not necessarily intuitive to you and I. Number 2, the 4 best practices of renaming. And again, we only select the variables we're going to use for analysis. We rename the variables to something that is easy for us to remember and to type, and use lowercase for the variable names, again, because it's less characters. And finally, use production-worthy labels for your plots and your tables and that sort of thing. Third learning objective, 2 different ways to rename a variable. And again, there's the rename function, which is easy if you're just trying to rename a few. And it takes the argument new name is equal to old name. And then the set_names function, which is great if you're trying to rename the entire data set. Number 4, understand the difference between the two. Again, set underscore names is great if you're trying to rename the entire data set, but it has the limitation that you have to make sure that the number of elements that you are naming is equal to the number of columns. Number 5, know how to change the axis labels in FlexPlot. And again, all you have to do is put a plus after your FlexPlot, and then labs, and then x equals your X name, Y equals your Y name. And then number 6, how to remove the legend. And then to do that, we just add plus theme legend.position equals open quote none. So hopefully that helps you figure out how to rename your variables so it's much easier to do your analysis. And as always, if there are any questions, let me know in the comments. See you next time. Peace out.